Hello, everyone. How are we doing? Just wanted to do a little bit of a preface for this interview. I've spoke to Jason Tuttle from Letters to Zachary, and he shares his journey of grief after losing his son, who he had a few disabilities and died about 4 years ago. But with the episode, I had some technical difficulties where the questions that I asked didn't get recorded on both the audio and video version. So what I've had to do is I've had to go back through and re-record those questions and add those in. So if you're watching this, you'll actually notice that I haven't had a shave in half of the video, half of the podcast, and I have in the other half. But if it is a little bit disjointed, I apologize for that. But I thought that this particular podcast was a really, really important one. It's a topic that doesn't get covered off a lot around grief, especially grief as it pertains to the loss of a child. There is some obviously quite heavy topics that we go through within this podcast, but I thought it was important not to just completely discard the podcast and to really go through and make sure that it is right, the questions are there, and that we're able to continue to share this conversation and share the message that Jason is putting out there. So I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I apologize in advance for what may be a little bit of a disconnect between the answers and the questions, but I've done my best to kind of piece it together. So thanks as always for listening, and please enjoy this conversation with Jason Tuttle from Letters to Zach. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Unstoppable Dad Project. This week, I am joined by Jason Tuttle. Jason has a blog, which is called Letters to Zachary, which is about his son who passed away a few years ago. And it's a conversation I'm excited to have. It's something that we obviously don't talk about a lot on the podcast, and I don't think that we talk about enough probably in day-to-day life. And there are a lot of people out there that are going through the grief process, and they're kind of going through it alone. So I thought it was really valuable to get Jason on the podcast to just share his experiences, what he's gone through, and hopefully lend some insight and some value into the grief process itself, and just everything that goes into what he's had to deal with over the time. So Jason, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time. Do you want to just let the listeners know, let them know your story and kind of what's brought you to this point now?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. I am a married father of 21 years this year to my wife. I'm a father of two kids, both of which were born with a multitude of medical special needs, both cognitive and physical disabilities. My son was born also with a rare condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome, which the easiest way to describe it is he was born without any abdominal muscle at all. Like if I were to lay him on the floor, the only thing between his organs and the outside world would have been the skin and the fascia that kind of holds the skin together. Like when he would lay on the floor, I could literally with my finger touch his lower intestine, his upper intestine, his kidney, literally everything. And so the Eagle-Barrett syndrome is that, and it's a rare condition because they know it starts with a kidney issue, but they don't know the official cause of it. Now, some of the side things that go along with it, like when he was younger, I would have to give him a catheter every 4 hours of his life just because he never got the sensation to have to go to the bathroom. So I would have to do it until he finally kind of got to the point where he would go on his own. He had a diminished lung capacity, which meant he could breathe normally, but like when you and I get a bronchitis style chest cold, he couldn't cough it out. So if I couldn't get it with like the machinery I had in my house, I almost assuredly went to the hospital, went to the ER, and was admitted typically for about a week every time that happened. And for about the first 5 or 6 years of his life, he was in and out of the hospital about every 6 months because of it. Until we had a surgery. My daughter was born 2 years later, and she had all of the same identical issues except for the rare condition. So within the first 2 years of my wife and I being married, we had two kids with multiple disabilities, some rare, um, and the others being identical, meaning the identical things between my two kids are both of them had neurological delays. They were severely delayed, which means my son was 15 when he passed, and my daughter, who will be 16 this year, both functioned about 4 to 6 years old. They will probably always function about that age. They are both epileptic. Of the six different kinds of seizures, I've seen four of them in my house. They are both nonverbal. They're essentially wheelchair bound, although I can hold them behind, like under their arms, and they can walk and they can army crawl, but like to walk on their own, no, they can't. And then outside of that, we haven't officially gotten the word, but genetics seems to think. Now, unfortunately, my son has passed, but genetics seems to think that both my son and daughter actually have a genetic condition that is case number one. And I'm not saying case number one for our doctor. I mean case number one, period. And so all of this is kind of the first 3 years of our lives is what we're finding out to kind of paint the picture of what life is like. So my son was the more medically fragile of the two. So he was the one that was always in and out of the hospital. Between my two kids, we had six specialists that we had to see every 6 months, on the north side of the city in which I live. And so, kind of our daily routine was I'd get them both up. I'd have to lift them out of their bed. I'd get them ready. I'd get them in their wheelchairs. I'd get all their braces and things on. The bus would come. I'd kind of shove them off to school. I would do kind of the stay-at-home parent stuff that I would do every day, which is your typical housework, but towards the latter part of the day included kind of my medical procedures that I knew that I had to do when my kids got home. And then I did that all the way until they went to bed, and I kind of recycled and repeated every day is what I did. As a parent with a child with a chronic illness, although it's not likely that they'll pass away, it was always something that was kind of in the back of my mind, just because of when he did go to the hospital, my son, that is, it was always a major issue. There was never a light time that he was in the hospital. When I would take him for his respiratory illnesses, he would be in there where it was just forming, and then overnight it would just explode, and he would just be completely congested. And like I had to be in the hospital, because even with what I had in the house, there's no way I could have taken care of it at home without medical professionals. So, we do this for the next 12, 13 years of my son's life. This was kind of the daily routine, me being a stay-at-home parent and taking care of him, doing all that kind of stuff. And then about 3 days before my son passed, both of my kids had come home. I got them, out of their school clothes, kind of in just their loungewear, so they could kind of goof off. I made my kids dinner. Both my kids ate like a horse. And then typically what would happen would be is I would put my daughter to bed first, and then bring my son in my wife and I's bedroom to give them some one-on-one time. Just because I love my daughter, but my daughter she can be intense. And so there would be times, even though my son couldn't talk, he would look at me and just give me this look of, I need a break from her. And so I would put her to bed. And plus, my daughter was very routine. So if I didn't put her to bed by 7:30, she was giving me a hard time anyways. So I put her to bed, and that night we lounged for about an hour. And then my wife went to go brush his teeth, and we initially thought she went back just a little too far and kind of hit the gag reflex, and he threw up a little bit, which didn't really surprise us. And so I looked at him and I went, well, maybe you hit the gag reflex and he had something in his system and just came up. Didn't think much about it, put him to bed. Well, that night he was up and down all night, which is unusual for him. And because I was a stay-at-home parent, I told my wife, I said, I'm going to text the teacher. I'm going to keep him home because I think he might have a 24-hour virus, which he's had many times in his life. And I don't know if he's contagious. And I don't, because both my kids are in a self-contained special ed classroom. And I didn't want to, if it was contagious, spread it to other kids with medical needs. So I texted his teacher. She said, okay, that's fine. We'll see you tomorrow, that kind of thing. And so I kept him home, and all day I kept telling him, buddy, you can take a nap, because I knew he was tired because he hadn't slept the night before. And I said, buddy, you're not missing anything. Day's just going to be sitting on the couch. I'm going to be on my laptop. You can take a nap. He absolutely refused to. So that evening, he was having a hard time drinking like liquids and things like that, which towards the latter part of the day kind of caught my attention. I was just like, it's been all day. He hadn't really drank a whole lot. This is starting to concern me. And so I kept him home the next day because I was just like, because it was butting up to a holiday. And I just said, what, I'm going to keep him home another day. If he's not feeling well, at least I'll have the weekend for him to recover. And then hopefully by Monday, he'll be recovered. I can go back to school. So we put him down that night. He immediately gets quiet, and we just think he's exhausted. We think he's just tired. He fell asleep. So we go to bed. We get up the next morning, do the same routine, except we get my daughter off. And then about 8:30 that morning, we walk into his room. And typically, when we walk into his room, he'll get really excited. He'll bounce on his bed like he's excited to see us. And so when we went in there that morning, he woke up and he looked at us. He didn't really bounce, and he didn't look lethargic, but he wasn't bouncing, and that kind of caught my attention. I walked over to the right side of him, and I noticed a dark green streak of something coming out of his mouth. And I looked at my wife and I went, the only thing dark green in the body is bile. And why is it coming out of his mouth? And if it is coming out of his mouth, that's not good at all. And so I pick him up out of bed, and he's kind of lethargic and floppy, which even at this point didn't really strike me as anything, because when a couple of times when he was really sick with like a pneumonia style, he was that way. And I thought, well, I said, maybe he's really sick. I need to really see what's going on. So I take him out in the living room. I go through my medical protocol that I typically go through. Nothing's working. Now, out of the ordinary, typically, even without abdominal muscles, his midsection was always very pliable, like it was almost spongy. And so I went to go press his midsection just to feel around and make sure his bladder wasn't full. And it was rock hard. I mean, it was like cinder block wall rock hard. And that caught my attention. And so I sit there and look at him for a second. I look at my wife and I'm taking him up to the hospital. I said, something's not right. And I don't know what it is. And it's not respiratory. It's not urological. I said, so I'm taking him up. She said, okay. So I get him dressed. I get him in the van. I'm doing 90 miles an hour up to the hospital. I get into the ER and I skip the line. And, the security guard walks over to me to say, almost as if to say, you need to get in line. And I look at him and go, I don't think he's breathing. I need help. And so the nurse comes over to me, and I've been in this hospital 100 times. And this is the first time I've ever gone in a full run back into the ER to a trauma room to get him help. So we're in the room. I instinctively put him on the table. I back out of the way in hopes that they'll let me stay in there just because he's nonverbal and I can tell him what's going on. And they do. And they immediately start chest compressions. And, in between this, the head ER docs ask me, why did you bring him in? How long has he been this way? And all these questions. And, after about 10 minutes of chest CPR, they shock them, and literally nothing happens on that monitor. And even though my brain doesn't conceptualize it at that point, in my head, I go, he's not coming back. I had looked at those monitors 1,000 times, and with the way it reacted after they did that, I thought, he's not coming back. And so they worked on him for about 45 minutes, and then they pronounced him about an hour after I brought him to the hospital that morning. I will say, I had a moment there, understandably, and then I regained composure, and as a father of a special needs child, you learn very quickly you've got to kind of compartmentalize things just so you can get things done. And, I needed information. I'll never forget that phone call that I made home to his mother that thought he was just being admitted for an illness, that he was going to be, come home in a week, whereas he was sitting dead on a table not an hour after she just saw him. She made a sound I'll never forget. And then after that, I had to call my mother, his grandmother. I'll never forget her response. And so it kind of went from there. That's kind of how, in kind of the short version of kind of life and how we got to the point that my son passed.
Thanks for sharing that. So, after going through all of that, what do the next couple of days look like?
So, after my son had passed away, obviously I had a moment, and then I regained composure and I kind of compartmentalized things. And so the care team came in and, offered their condolences. And, I told them thank you for that. And I looked at her and I said, this is going to sound cold and callous. And I pointed to my son and I said, but I'll deal with this in a minute. I said, but I need to know some answers. And she goes, well, what do you need to know? And I said, well, first of all, I said, are y'all going to do an autopsy? If you are, what's the reason why you're going to do an autopsy? If you're not, what's the reason why you're not going to do an autopsy? Kind of what's the protocol as to why you would or would not do an autopsy? I said, if you decide to do an autopsy, I said, what's kind of the turnaround time? When can I get my son? When we get the results? That kind of thing. And I said, excuse me, I said, just so I can get him to a funeral home and have those services. And I said, if you choose not to do an autopsy, I said, what information do I need so I can tell a funeral home? How can I get my son home? All that pertinent information. And so she goes, well, the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to go down to the corner and talk to him and see what he wants to do. And I said, okay. And so it takes her about 5 minutes, and I'm up with my son, and my wife is having her parents bring her up because, like I told her, I said, you don't need to be driving, have your parents drive you up. And so the head of the care team came back up. She said, well, the coroner has decided that he's not going to do an autopsy. And I look right at her and go, why? Why is he not going to do an autopsy? I said, I want to know the answer as to why you're not going to do an autopsy. And so she looks at me and she said, well, typically in a children's hospital, she said, there's only really like 3 or 4 reasons as to why we would actually do an autopsy. She said, first would be as if he came in completely healthy and then all of a sudden he passed away from something and we had no idea what it was. Second would be abuse related. Third would be criminally related. And then fourth would be drug related. She said, outside of those, she said, we typically don't do an autopsy. And she said, because your son had such the extensive history with his medical special needs, he said the coroner's just decided that they're going to relate it to one of his medical special needs. And I said, okay. So, but on the death certificate, it says sepsis and cardiac arrest due to sepsis. However, even though it's not official, based on the signs and symptoms I saw before I took him to the hospital, and then all the wording I heard as they were doing the hits trying to save his life, and then I requested the ER notes and what I read in there, I 100% believe that he had contracted gastroenteritis at some point, and it went way too far. And even the head ER doc goes, even in the hospital, if a patient gets sepsis and we don't catch it and it gets in the bloodstream, she said the fatality rate of that is ridiculously high. She said it's like 95%. She said it's something crazy. And so honestly, she said, honestly, I think that's what happened was he got sepsis from an infection. It got into his bloodstream, it got into his heart, and it just went downhill from there. So, that was kind of the initial process after he had passed away. They tell you that you experienced the worst experience in your life, and the next day you've got to go in and make 1,000 decisions as it relates to the funeral. And that's exactly what it was. We went in. Actually, no, we went that afternoon. I stand corrected. We went that afternoon, and we went to a place because my father-in-law had one of his relatives passed away recently. So we went to the place that he used. And because they knew him and they were kind of familiar with the process, we're just like, well, let's go here first, just because I don't want to randomly pick someone that I don't know anything about. And so we get in there, and you walk into their kind of showroom, if you will, and there's a wall of something over here and a wall of something over, all these decisions you can make. And they were really nice, and they offered condolences. And I said, today we're getting information, and I said, what's the process? How does it work? What do we need to do? We've never done this before. And he goes, well, he said, typically, he said, you're either, burying or cremating. He said, of the two, cremating is typically a little less expensive than burying. And he said, if you're going to bury, he said, we do all the preparation processes, but the actual burial, you have to go to a grave site, and you have to pay for that. And you have to pay for the headstone, and, all these things that we kind of knew about. And he said, that process right there can go anywhere from a couple $1,000s to $50,000, depending on what you're wanting. And I said, okay. And, he gave us all the other options. And he said, now, as for us, he said, we do it one of two ways. He said, we offer packages from minimal all the way to just extravagant, or you can do it, a la carte, if you will. And I mean, he was very upfront. Yeah, I never felt like he was trying to upsell us anything, but he was just like, understand that everything costs. He said, that's one of the reasons why funerals are so expensive. Everything has a price. And I said, okay. And I said, well, we're going to make an appointment for tomorrow. We'll come back tomorrow. We'll make a decision. And so we came back the next day, and he goes, well, what have you decided? We said, well, we've decided on this package because this meets our needs. And I said, we want to add one or two things to it. And he said, okay, that's fine. And he goes, are you wanting to bury or cremate? And we said, we've decided that we want to cremate, just because should we move from this area, we want to be able to bring our son with us versus him buried in a spot. He said, okay, that's fine. And so we go through the process, and I have a weird sense of humor in stressful situations. And so we said, we're gonna cremate. And he pulls out this piece of paper, and he goes, the U.S. federal government makes me tell you. And I went, stop. I said, what does the U.S. federal government want to know anything about my son's cremation? And he pauses for a second, and he looks at us again, and he goes, the U.S. federal government is making me tell you and inform you that the state in which your loved one enters the crematorium will not be the same state in which they leave the crematorium. He said, I want to make sure you were 100% clear on that. And I stopped, and right in the middle, and I didn't mean to say it, but man, I dropped an F-bomb. I looked at him and went, who in the F thinks you can put a human body in fire and have it come back out the exact same way that it went in? And he never says anything to me, and he just gives me this look of, you would be amazed at what people have said to me over this process. And so, I mean, this form was double-sided. We had to sign it like 8 times on both sides, saying that we fully understood. And I just looked at him and I went, the way this world is going, that people think that they can reverse this just blows my mind. So, we get through this process, and, we don't have it right. It's about a week before we have it. And we have a viewing and a service, and then he gets cremated. And so it's from that point where the difficult part starts. I mean, we had a difficult time from the time in which he passed away, but the real difficult part started from the time, after we had the service, we have our son back, all the fanfare, if you will, stops, meaning like people bringing over meals and people stopping by the house, that kind of thing. And then, you really learn the old statement, the silence is deafening. And so it was at that point, it really started hitting my wife and I.
So, what led you to start the blog and really share what you've been through and your own personal journey? Because it's something that is quite hard to do, to put out there. And selfishly, it would have been quite easy for you to just keep within yourself and not share that. So, what's led to you sharing your story and you doing what you're doing now?
I'm a big proponent of counseling or therapy, and I was seeing a counselor at the time, and about my fifth or sixth session after everything had happened, she suggested to me one day, she goes, "Have you ever thought about journaling?" And my ironic answer was, I don't think that's my thing. I don't think I'm a real good writer or anything. And so she said, well, keep it as an idea. She said, it can be very cathartic, even if you type it, print it out, and throw it in the fire and burn it. At least you can kind of get it out. And I said, okay. And that idea I wrote down, and it literally sat on my side table for probably 8 months afterwards. I mean, I didn't touch it for the longest time. And then one day I was sitting on my couch on my laptop and I was having a really hard time. I was having an emotional moment, and I opened up a Word document, and in letter form, I put the date on there. Dear Zachary, and I just wrote in letter form. And the way I write is in the moment. And like, if I felt like in that moment I needed to have it F bombs in it and expletive laden, because that's just the gut feeling I was feeling, that's how I wrote it. And now, granted, it wasn't all that, and I mean, it was a few here and there, but it was still to get the point across of what I was feeling in the moment. And so I did that for several weeks, and I'm a researcher. So after everything happened, I got on Facebook, and we all know that Facebook has a group for everything. I found a group that related to me, and I got to know the admin real well. And one day I asked her, I said, "Do you mind if I post some of my journal entries?" She goes, "No, we'd love for you to do it, because we get so few men in here that are actually willing to open up. We'd love to see what your thought process is." And so I did, and almost immediately I got a massive response. It kind of surprised me, the response I got. And so I did that, and then I posted another one. I got a similar response, and every time I would post, I get these just big responses. And I mean, I had some women go, we don't know each other, and I've never told anybody exactly how I feel or what's kind of in my gut of how this is just tearing me up. And she's just like, after reading your letter, you have exactly explained exactly how I feel, word for word. And I went, well, I appreciate it that, this is inspired by my son. And I said, it means a lot that I can write something that resonates with you. And so that's how I did it for a while. And then I started getting people going, well, have you ever thought about doing a podcast? And at that time I was just, I don't know if I have the brain space for that quite yet. I might down the road. And then people would say, well, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I said, yeah, that's kind of on the back burner. But at the time in which people were asking me, I didn't think I had enough material to even start a book, let alone produce a book. Now I probably do, but at that time I didn't. And then finally someone said out of the blue, they said, well, if you're not going to do those other two things, have you ever thought about like doing a Facebook page and making kind of a grief blog and all that? And I went, I could do that. I could at least copy and paste it. And so that's what I started doing. And, in the beginning, it was your typical, you'd make a page, you'd have just family and friends following. So it was about 10 or 20 people, that kind of thing. And just one day out of the blue, I went, you know what, I'm going to start reaching out to some of what I would consider some of the bigger names in the grief community, and just ask them if they would be willing to give me pointers. And that's what I did. And I just said, hey, my name is so-and-so. I'm trying to create this grief blog, trying to get it out to people I think it can help. Can you give me pointers? And literally all of them were like, yeah, what do you need help on? And I would say, well, this is what I'm thinking I'm going to do. And they would say, well, if you're ever going to do a book, you're going to need to build a website so you can, guide people to it. And, somewhere where you can sell it from, that kind of thing. If you're going to go this direction, you want to do A, B, and C. And so I got a lot of tips like that. And so from that point, it really started growing. At one point I was getting like 100 followers a month, that kind of thing. It just seemed like it was just blowing up for me. And so fast forward to now, in just 9 months, I've got over 1,000 followers. I've got representation in 44 of the 50 U.S. states, and representation as of the other day, I think it's 24 countries in just 9 months. And so if you'd have told me in the beginning of this that I would have a page that would reach
That's it's
that
such
far,
a
I would have
it
laughed
all it
at you.
sounds like it's a
So,
selfless thing to do, right? Because a lot of us want to keep those feelings and emotions, and we almost feel too vulnerable when we share it. And I was scrolling through, your Instagram page and your Facebook page, kind of in
mhm,
preparation for today, going through it, and some of the things that you're sharing are quite raw and
mhm,
honest. And for
mhm,
especially men today, we don't want to
mhm,
do that. And especially in the position that you're in, talk
mhm,
about some of it, because you mentioned journaling and you're like, hey, that's not really my thing. Like, talk about
mhm.
some of the thoughts, the self-doubt that you had, like getting to the point where you were okay to share some of this.
Those of us in the grief community, we all get to the point, in the beginning we tend to almost verbally vomit on people just because we want to get it out. And then we start learning, like, because my kids were nonverbal, I got really good at reading body language. Like, I could read my son to a letter. He could just give me a look and I could tell what he was feeling, what he was doing, that kind of thing. And so in the beginning, when people would ask me, I would almost just like verbally vomit on them. But I started to learn that when I would tell some people, I could see in their eyes when they would say, well, how are you doing? I could tell that they were asking just because it's the polite thing to do. They didn't really want to know the ins and outs of it. They didn't want me to get in depth on it. They wanted to ask me enough so that they could fulfill a social requirement to feel good about themselves. That, hey, I asked him how he was doing, kind of thing. And then that's all they really wanted. And so, in the beginning, I wasn't sharing it just because it, it, it was my emotion. It was a lot of it, like a lot of men feel, it's, do I want to be vulnerable to people and risk? Now, I'll probably get a lot of good reaction, but there's also a risk that I may get a lot of bad reaction to it. And I said, with the state of mind that I'm in, can I handle someone coming up and saying something that I feel like is offensive to me? And, you know, well before my son passed away, one day I just got to this mindset of, instead of complaining about something, do something about it. And that was kind of when I finally decided to start posting it. It was one of those, well, this is cathartic to me. Hopefully I can help other people. This is doing something about it. And if someone were to come back and make some ridiculous comment, I could say, well, at least I'm making an effort trying to be an example of what can be done. Am I perfect at it? No stretch of the imagination, but at least I'm doing something. I'm making an effort. And so that's kind of what got the ball rolling. The biggest thing was,
Hmm.
if I hadn't have gotten that initial reaction I did, we probably might not be talking. But because I got such the big reaction and people liked it so much, in my brain, I went, hey, maybe I have something here. Let's build on this and see if I still get the same response. And so that's kind of how that all went. Now, I will say in the beginning, Letters to Zachary, it was specifically just for men, and it was just because all the groups I'd ever been in, it was 95% women, it was 5% men, and of that 5% there might have been maybe half a percent that actually commented on a somewhat regular basis. And so what I was looking for was, maybe they didn't understand exactly what I was dealing with, but if they had lost a child, they would have kind of a ballpark. And that's what I was looking, and I couldn't find it. But since then, it started out for men, and then I opened it up for anybody that had lost a loved one, and then finally up to today, I've opened it to everybody, including and specifically women, girlfriends, spouses, mothers, that kind of thing, in hope to be able to give them an understanding of how men grieve so that they can help their significant other. Because even to this day, I still get women that ask me, they go, we lost our child X number of months ago or a year ago. He's still not opening up. What can I do to help him to open up? And I'll go, well, I've got 10 points that I can tell you about that I think will help. They might not, but I wrote them as if this was what would help me, which I think are pretty universal. And so that's kind of how all this evolved into Letters to Zachary. And even though I was in a difficult time, it was very cathartic to me to be able to write what I had to get out. And then it became even more cathartic when I was getting all of the positive feedback.
So it sounds as though the process was not just beneficial to others, but you found it quite beneficial as well.
Very much so. In fact, as of earlier this week, my wife said, you may not see it, but this, doing Letters to Zachary and the Grief podcast and all of those things associated with creating whatever this brand is, she said there's been a huge change since when we lost him to this point. So, at least my wife notices it, although I may not.
So, Jason, you mentioned the way others were to you, people who were interacting with you. They obviously were there from a capacity of wanting to help you, wanting to be there for you and be there for your family. And you kind of mentioned that there was a drop off at where it was that initial stage, and then eventually the communication and the support from others tended to drop off. I was wondering if you could share just some advice from your perspective to those people who are on the outside looking in and they want to support someone who's going through this, like yourself, but they're not quite sure what to do, because it can be a bit, I guess the best way to describe it, you're not quite sure exactly where you want to step and where the boundary is and what you should or shouldn't do to help. There's this inherent good and this inherent want to try and help somebody who's going through it, but you also don't want to be too invasive. You want to give people their space. Like, can you share a little bit of advice on what someone could do in order to help support someone like yourself who's going through potentially one of the toughest things that anyone could go through?
Has obviously evolved since everything happened. Initially I used to get really upset how I felt like, even though it wasn't true, I felt like, well, people don't care enough, and how could they act that way towards me? I just lost my son. But over time I got to the point of where I was sitting back thinking, well, who really wants to deal with grief until you're forced into it? I mean, because ultimately that's what it comes to. None of us that have lost a child or a loved one wanted this to happen. We were forced into this because of just life situations that made it happen. A lot of us in the grief community feel like after the fanfare is over, it's almost like we're forgotten. And none of us expect people to every day or anything like that. It's not that by in any way, but a lot of times we'll get, well, if you need anything, just reach out to me. And a lot of us will sit back and go, the one time we're going to be selfish is we're going to be, no, if I'm grieving losing my son, my daughter, my partner, you need to make the effort to reach out to me, because the last thing on my mind is going to be reaching out to you. And so the thing I would tell people is just more or less just be mindful of that. I mean, if we say something kind of harsh, it's not directed at you at all. There's a lot more going on in our brain. And so it's nothing personal. We might be having a bad moment in that moment, and we're trying our best not to break down. And the straw that breaks the camel's back comes across across us, and that's just where it comes out. We don't mean for it to be, you know. I would say the biggest thing is if you say that you want to know or you want to listen, then listen. I mean, now it's a lot easier for me to talk about it. But in the beginning, if I didn't want to talk about it, I would politely look at that person and go, you know what, I don't want to talk about it right now. And so I was never mean or rude to them about it. So don't be afraid to walk up to someone and think, well, just because you say my son's name, I'm going to break down and cry. Believe me, I know every day he's passed away. You're not going to remind me of that. And, you know, there's a lot of us that feel like once everything's done, we're just kind of pushed to the wayside. And a lot of us, from the time that we lose someone, we lose a lot of family and friends over, especially when people think that we've grieved too long, that we've gone beyond whatever the normal standard of grieving is. And so, yeah, I would I would tell people, just be mindful. We're not taking anything out against you. If you want to know, please ask. If you don't, I mean, honestly, if you don't want to know about that, we won't be offended if you don't want to ask about it. It's a difficult topic. I get the reason why some people don't want to talk about it, because it forces them to think about a difficult topic that they may not want to think about. Thinking about mortality and death is a very deep topic. And so, just talk to us normally. I mean, for the longest time, I would kind of get those, I hate to say it, but the pity responses. Hey, how are you? And I could immediately, based on the tone in which they were saying it to me. And again, I was never rude to them, but I wanted to go, just stop. Talk to me normally. Don't, just talk to me normally. And so, I mean, it's really that simple. It's not anything.
So I guess one of the biggest messages there is to just make sure that you keep supporting the person. Like, don't just go MIA after the first initial part of time has passed, right? Like, you want to make sure that you continue to support them, continue to reach out, and continue to be there for them even months and years after it's happened, because it's not a process that just stops. It's a ever growing process. Now, going through all that, you've mentioned how long you've been married for. How did you keep your marriage working? Like, what were some of the challenges that you had to go through with that? Because it's something that would be very, very hard to allocate time for and keep on track. So how did you keep your marriage on track going through all that?
Well, as kind of a side note, when we had our first child, and my son had special needs, we read some statistic, something to the effect that a marriage that has one special needs child, the rate of divorce is like 70%. So it's something way up there. And so, and not that that would have ever been a choice for us, because we literally told each other, uh, uh, before we ever got married and all that, I said, I'm only in this once. I'm not doing it again. And so, both of us have parents that, like, my parents this year been married 57 years. Her parents have been married getting upwards of about 50 years. And so I said, if there's issues, we'll work through them. So, we've certainly had our ups and downs. We just rely on each other. The strengths that I have, she may not have, and the strengths she has, I may not have. Like, she's definitely a heck of a lot more patient than I am. I will 100% tell you that I'm a person that a lot of times I want to move faster than the system will allow. It's how my ADD brain runs. My brain runs 1,000 miles a minute, and I'm like, to give you an example, like when she's saying something to me about, a suggestion, before she can finish, in my brain I probably have 5 different options, and I've really had to work on not spouting them out before she finishes. And so we rely on each other. We're both religious. We rely on our faith a good bit, and that helps. um and and in more of a kind of a comical sense, we're both very stubborn, and we're not going to let anything happen. We're just like, this will work, thick or thin, sinking or not, this will work. And so it's just kind of that mindset
That's
that we're
great.
in.
And one of the things that you put down on the form that we kind of that I get everybody to do before they come on here is you're just talking about men and opening up.
Mm-hmm.
And so to kind of start to wrap this
Uh-huh.
up and finish up, I just wanted to ask you, what's
Okay.
one piece of advice you could give to any man, whether they're going through the grieving process or not, to help them, I guess, get through any form of tough time that they're going through?
Um, we have to break this idea from society that men can't be vulnerable. Now, am I saying that men should go out and cry on other men's shoulders? No, I'm not saying that at all. But we have been taught from birth that we have to be the strength, the protector, the provider, and there's nothing wrong with that. But nobody can be strong all the time forever. You have to give yourself some time to kind of have some downtime, breakdown time, if you will. I mean, even men in war cry, because of just the emotional overload that scenario is. So, you know, we've just got to get this past this idea of being told what to do. And the irony in it all is, of the two genders, men of all people do not like being told what to do. That's the thing that strikes me the most. Men don't like being told what to do, but yet they're letting this outside source tell them what they can and cannot do when it relates to an emotion. And I mean, because men don't open up, it creates a lot of health issues, a lot of marriage issues, I mean, I could list on and on and on of what it causes. So we, we've got to get past this idea that it's not okay to open up, even if you're by yourself in your garage working on a car, or you're at a bar with your friends, or in your man cave with friends, that kind of people that you can trust. Because a lot of it for men comes down to, I will open up in front of those that I 100% trust, and if they don't 100% trust, they will not open up to them. So it's getting them in that scenario to get them to be
And
able to
it's
open up.
as a man, I think it's funny that you mentioned that, where as men we don't like to be told what to do, but then we're letting these preconditions dictate what we're
Mm-hmm.
doing to a point. But then also too, as
Yep.
a, like you mentioned something in the last for when we were talking about your marriage, and you were talking about you coming up with solutions and things like that. As men, I think we all naturally want to fix things as well too. Yet when we're dealing with
Yep.
emotional
Mm-hmm.
trauma or stress, we we don't want to take the steps to
Mm-hmm.
fix, though, like, or not, the fix may not be the right word, but to
Mm-hmm.
correct what potentially may be holding us back. So it's almost like on two fronts when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
men's mental and emotional health. We're fighting against two natural urges as men, where we're listening to somebody tell us what to do, but then we're not taking the steps we want to take in order to, move ourselves forward. So it's irony at its finest sometimes, isn't it? So,
Certainly.
Jason, I really appreciate you sharing everything that you did today. It's definitely a topic that I
Mm-hmm.
think we need to get more information on, especially from somebody who hasn't been, like, from my point of view, having not been through what you've been through,
Hmm.
for no other reason than being able to
Uh-huh.
more effectively support those that are going through it. Um, and then from the people that are going
Hmm.
through it, letting them know that it's okay to open up, and it's okay. There are support communities out there that where there are other people going through the same
Hmm.
thing. So on that note, do you want to let everybody know where they can find you, where they can find the groups that you've set up and everything like that?
Certainly. I am at this point social media based. Uh, I I am in the process of coming up with a website, but my main page is Letters to Zachary, just like it's written in the screen on Facebook. You can find it by writing Letters to Zachary. If you're looking for it, it's a younger picture of my whole family in there for those that are looking for it. My kind of secondary page would be TikTok. Those are Facebook and TikTok are the ones that I work on the most, and then I kind of filter things down through the other ones. But Facebook, TikTok is Letters to Zachary, but instead of the word TO, it's the number two if you're looking for it. And it's Letters to the number two on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram are where you can find those. As for TikTok, some of the materials the same as the one on Facebook, but a lot of it's different because that as we all know, TikTok's video form. And honestly, I never thought at my age I'd be doing TikTok
You and me
videos,
both. That's
but here we are. But here we are. But yeah, I'm on all the social media as Letters to Zachary, either
That's
TO
great.
or the
And
number two.
I do have the links to those. So I'm going to pop all of those links in the show notes when we publish this on the YouTube
Okay.
channel and on all the good podcast platforms. So, Jason, once again, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing your story. Thanks so much for joining us.
Mhm.
And everyone else, thanks for listening and
Thank
have
you.
a good day. Goodbye.